Hi guys, in this PowerPoint we are going to be talking about weathering. So this is going to be the first concept we're going to talk about in this unit, which includes weathering, soil, and erosion. So weathering and erosion and how they're related. So it's important to understand the relationship between weathering and erosion and how that they're different. So when we talk about weathering, we're talking about the breakdown of rocks, okay, that have been exposed to the atmosphere. Okay, then once the movement of those rocks happens, that's when we call it erosion. Okay, so weathering only applies to the breakdown of the rocks, whereas erosion is talking about the movement, okay, from one place to another. We will talk about different types of weathering, and we're also going to talk about different types of erosion in a different lecture. So just to kind of give you a heads up though, so erosion is going to be caused by wind, water, ice, and also by gravity. An important note is that most erosion that takes place on the earth is caused by moving water. It's a very powerful force, and it will erode soil, mountains, things very quickly. All right, so let's go switch gears and go back to types of weathering. So there's two types of weathering that we are going to talk about. The first one is going to be mechanical weathering, and the second is going to be chemical weathering. So we're going to talk about specific examples of each. But first, let's talk about what mechanical weathering is. So rocks are going to be broken down into smaller pieces without changing their chemical composition, okay? So it doesn't change what they're made of. So it'd like be taking a piece, let's say a sugar cube, and you break it down, it's still sugar, okay? You're not changing what that chemical composition is. Same thing with, like, let's say salt, okay? It doesn't matter the size of the salt grain, okay? It's still salt. Now, when we talk about chemical weathering, we're talking about the actual change in composition, okay? So they're going to become a different substance. So just know that a mechanical weathering is physical change, okay? And chemical is going to be that chemical change. It's actually going to change in composition. So the first type of mechanical weathering we're going to talk about is ice wedging or frost action. Okay, so this obviously involves water since it involves ice. And so what happens is water is going to enter small cracks in the rock, and then, as hopefully you guys all know, once water freezes, it actually expands, okay? And once it expands, it's going to force that crack open more. And that process will repeat over and over again until the rock breaks down. So here's just a really good example. So you have a crack in the rock, and water is going to enter. Once water freezes, it's going to expand, and you can see visually what happens. Okay, that crack becomes larger and larger and larger until it actually splits the rock in half. Again, so here is an example in nature. So you have your crack. Okay, if it rains, snows, sleets, any sort of precipitation is going to allow water to enter into the crack. If it freezes, then that water will expand and break the rock. The second type of weathering we're going to talk about, or mechanical weathering, is wetting and drying. So it's going to break up rocks that are made of clay. Again, so when they're wet, they're going to expand, and then they shrink as they dry. And as this repeats over and over, the clay is going to become brittle, okay, until it actually falls apart. So just think of all the projects that you may have made out of clay. Maybe you've taken a ceramics class. Eventually, they're all going to crack and fall apart, and that's because of the wetting and the drying. So unless you glaze it, you protect it, it's going to go through this mechanical weathering process. So here's another example of that wetting and drying. The next type of mechanical weathering we're going to talk about is exfoliation. So you might have heard this term before, when you exfoliate your skin, okay? So basically it's when soil and rock is removed, okay, and it's going to expose that rock found deep within underground. So that's going to release the pressure, and it's going to allow the rock to expand and then eventually to crack. So you can kind of see the cracks in the surface of this rock right here. There's another example of that expansion and then the cracking. And eventually this breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces and will become part of the soil. Another picture. The last type of mechanical weathering we're going to talk about are plant roots and then also lichens and moss. So plant roots are also going to do something similar that water does. And so what happens is the plant roots become part of the rock. And as they do so, they're also creating cracks, which will break the rocks. Lichen and moss are really cool plants, and what they do is they actually are secreting enzymes that break down the rocks and create soil. And so lichens and moss are actually what we call primary succession species. And what succession means is that in cases of, let's say, a volcano erupts and forms a new island that is strictly igneous rock, there's no soil for plants to grow. And what lichen and moss do is they're going to break down that rock into soil so that other plants can start becoming habitants on that particular place. And so they're going to be the first type of organisms that are going to break down soil so that other organisms can then live there as well. So again, here's that root wedging. All right, so now let's talk about chemical weathering. So before, again, mechanical is going to be strictly the breaking down, okay? The properties stay exactly the same. The rock is still chemically exactly the same, which is not the case for chemical weathering. So the first type chemical weathering we're going to talk about is hydrolysis. So water is going to react with minerals and it's going to change the chemical composition of the rock. So for example, we start off with feldspar, and once it reacts with water, it will form clay, which is chemically different than feldspar. Then we have oxidation. So just like the name sounds, it's going to be a reaction with oxygen. Okay, now oxygen is going to react with some minerals, especially iron, and it's going to form rust called iron oxide. So again, this occurs faster with water, and I'm sure you guys have all seen rust before, but it's that exposure of the iron to the oxygen in the atmosphere, and it will chemically convert iron into iron oxide. So again, here's that chemical weathering again. You can see the oxidation happening. It's also going to have that signature color of red. Again, we see the iron banding in basalt, and it's also what is oxidizing. So again, you can see that signature red in the banding of the rock. Here's more oxidative weathering of mineral deposits. So in this case, the new deposits are white or yellow, and then those weathered deposits that have aged with time will turn that reddish brown. The next type of chemical weathering we're going to talk about is carbonic acids. So carbon dioxide, which is CO2, which you guys all know to be in our atmosphere. It's also a greenhouse gas, you guys have probably heard. And so what happens is carbon dioxide is going to dissolve in water to form carbonic acid. And so this is where we get the term acid rain. So acid rain causes minerals to dissolve, especially those containing calcite. So you can see this gnarled rock is going to be weathered, chemically changed by that carbonic acid or that acid rain. Here's another example. Also, this is going to be the type of chemical weathering that we see in the monuments in Washington, D.C. So there's a huge preservation act going on right now that are trying to preserve those limestone monuments because they are weathering from the acid rain or the carbonic acid over time. So we're trying to preserve those and keep them for many generations. All right, so what is going to affect the rates of weathering, whether things are fast or slow? So one thing is going to be the rock's resistance to weathering, hardness. So if you guys remember, every rock is going to have a specific number on that scale, that Mohs scale that we talked about. So something like a diamond is not going to weather, okay? Where if we have, let's say, I don't know, pumice or clay or something like that, okay? It's going to affect how fast it weathers. The amount of surface area. So the greater the surface area, the faster the weathering is going to occur. Also climate. So climate's important. So chemical weathering is going to occur faster in warm, wet climates. So water is going to drive that rate. It's going to increase it. Whereas mechanical weathering is going to occur faster in cold or dry climates. So you can kind of see the central area of the rock was less resistant to weathering. Okay, so that's how that arch was formed, which is really cool, a natural wonder. Again, you can see this portion of the rock was less resistant to the weathering. Again, when we talked about that surface area, so the greater the surface area is going to increase the rate of weathering. So if we talk about surface area, it's going to be the amount of exposure the rock is to whatever the weathering mechanism is. So again, and through that process, weathering actually increases more surface area. So when we have, let's say, the ice that creates the crack, once it breaks down the rock, we have more surface area, and that is going to expose it to more weathering. So you can kind of see this is an example. So if we start off with a rock like this, we have some sort of weathering mechanism. So now instead of just the four sides, or I shouldn't say four sides, the sides of the cube being exposed, now we have four cubes being exposed, okay? And then let's say those are exposed to weathering as well, okay? So now the more surface area, the easier it is to weather or to break down. Again, dry climate, you're going to see that mechanical weathering. A warm climate, you're going to see chemical weathering. And typically it's also wet as well. So that's the Parthenon. The Parthenon is being exposed to that carbonic acid. All right, so that's the basics of weathering, chemical weathering versus mechanical weathering. Next, we're going to talk about how those types of weathering will create soil, and then we will talk about erosion. Again, if you guys have any questions, you need to tutor with me, make sure you email, Skype, or Zoom. Bye, guys. Thanks.